Robert Maudsley isn't quite what you typically call a serial killer, even though he's responsible for 4 deaths. When he was free, he killed just one person. The other 3 murders happened while he was in prison. Maudsley has been serving a life sentence since 1974 and has spent around 40 years in solitary confinement, where guards only approach him in groups and follow strict security protocols. Robert Maudsley's story was the inspiration for Thomas Harris' series about Dr. Hannibal Lecter. Although Maudsley isn't a psychiatrist or a gourmet, there are many similarities between him and the fictional character. You can easily spot these parallels yourself. Robert John Maudsley was born on June 26, 1953 in Toxteth, near Liverpool. He was the 4th child of Jean Maudsley, who went on to have 8 more children. Robert's father, George, was a lorry driver with a twisted approach to family life. Frustrated by his own miserable existence as an alcoholic, he took out his anger on his perpetually pregnant wife and their children, beating them mercilessly whenever he could. 6-month-old Bob Maudsley had a rare stroke of luck when his parents placed him and his 3 older brothers in Nazareth House, a Catholic orphanage. Robert lived there until he was 6 and remembered those years as the best of his life. The nuns cared for him, read to him, and took him on walks. He might have ever grown up to become a Catholic priest if things had continued that way. But then, unexpectedly, his parents decided to take him and his brothers back home. From that point on, Robert's life became a living hell. His mother had deteriorated badly during their time apart, and his father had become a filthy, drunken brute. George Maudsley's abuse of children was brutal and quite sophisticated. Later, in conversations with police psychologists, the man said horrific things that were hard to believe in. Once, his father locked Robert in a room for 6 months, with the boy's diet consisting only of bread and water. Also, as a nightmare, Maudsley recalls an incident when his drunken father raped him for a broken glass. After 1.5 years of child abuse, Jean and George were stripped of their parental rights, and their many offspring were distributed to orphanages in various parts of the UK. Robert was a bright and handsome child. That's why a lot of people tried to adopt him more than once, but unfortunately the domestic torture caused a lot of damage to the boy's mental state, and he began to stutter and suffer from urinary troubles. Besides, the child was characterized by retinence, which irritated the guardians. Robert was taken away from his family and returned to the orphanage until he got tired of it. At the age of 16, young Maudsley escaped from state care. For life, the runaway chose London, where he thought it was easy to earn a living even without a profession. But after a little time, the guy realized that an underage boy without documents and work skills isn't needed by anyone, and in order not to starve, he began to work as a part-time male prostitute. At first, he took food and clothes from his clients as payment, but soon began to offer himself for money. Maudsley realized that his life was going down the drain, but he knew no other options to survive, and there was no one to help him. The worst thing was that the young man heard voices that ordered him to kill his parents. Even after a decade, the killer is sure that if he had killed his mother and father as a teenager, as the voices in his head demanded, no one else would have suffered. Robert tried to break out of the vicious circle. He turned to psychologists and psychiatrists, but they didn't find any deviations in him. The young man had 2 unsuccessful suicide attempts, after which he gave up on himself and stopped fighting with his mental illness. The final deformation of the personality of Maudsley underwent after acquaintance with drugs on which he was hooked by a regular client. Regular use of drugs deprived Robert of breaks, and it led him to the first murder. The victim of the young man was his client, just a factory worker, John Farrell, and he paid with his life for showing Maudsley photos of his son with the raped and beaten by him children. In a rage, 20-year-old Robert threw a sheet round the neck of the freak and mercilessly strangled John. Just 2 days later, the murder was solved and the young killer was arrested. According to British law, for premeditated murder is a life sentence, but having learned about the voices in the head of the guy, he was sent to a psychiatric clinic for examination. The doctors carefully studied the young criminal and were surprised to find out that the extreme degree of antisociality was combined with a very high level of intelligence. The young man, who had only a few grades of orphanage school behind him, was very well read, could hold a conversation on various topics, and could easily solve the most complex logical problems. An examination of Robert Maudsley revealed that the young man was insane and needed treatment in a closed psychiatric hospital. Robert was transferred from prison to the Broadmoor Specialized Hospital, and justice forgot about him for a while. The hospital, where the mad murderer was recognized, was created specifically for bloodthirsty psychopaths and mentally ill rapists. In Broadmoor was the most reliable in England security and the strictest regime of detention. In the hospital, Maudsley received a nickname, Blue, because the details of the murder committed by him, including the fact that the corpse of the victim had a blue face, has long been circulated with journalists, but only 2 years passed, and Robert began to be affectionately called Spoon. The history of obtaining this nickname is monstrous. In Broadmoor, Maudsley befriended another criminal, David Cheeseman. The two of them captured one of the patients undergoing compulsory treatment for pedophilia and barricaded with him in one of the wards. For 9 hours, the clinic staff and the police unsuccessfully tried to negotiate the release of the hostage. When Maudsley and Cheeseman finally surrendered, there was no one to save. The hostage was not only killed, but also expertly dismembered with homemade knives. The open skull of the dead man was empty, and in place of the brain, mockingly jingling tablespoon. As the face was smeared in blood, only Maudsley, the investigators concluded that it was he who ate the brain of the dead man. After this gruesome episode, Maudsley was sent to the hospital of high-security prison Wakefield. This penal institution was the harshest in the British Isles, and the conditions of detention were not only conducive to apathetic antics, but this did not stop Maudsley, and he managed to arrange in the most secure part of the prison bloody bacchanalia. First, the killer stabbed to death inmate Sally Deerwood, who was serving time for a series of rapes. Robert stabbed the victim 12 times with a homemade sheath made from furniture fittings. Hiding the body under his bunk, Maudsley began to look for a second victim, and it was a certain Bailey Roberts, whom the maniac first stabbed with his homemade knife, and then began to beat his head against the bars, turning the victim's skull into mush. Maudsley went to the officer on duty, in front of whom he appeared in a bloody, from head to toe prison uniform. Robert calmly informed the stunned guard officer that the 2 prisoners he had killed wouldn't attend the evening inspection for a valid reason. Many believe that the maniac committed the double murder in order to be re-declared insane and sent back to treatment, but the massacre in this prison did not ease Maudsley's conditions. After the trial, which added a couple of more life sentences to Robert, he was locked up in solitary confinement for 5 years. But this was not enough, and a separate high-security cell was created for the monster, which was located in a separate wing of the prison. The facility was made personally for the ogre, and life in it was full of innovations. In the box with concrete and glass, there are no windows facing the street, also provided a high level of noise insulation. No extraneous sound does not reach the ear of the prisoner without the knowledge of the prisoners. All furniture in the cell is made of pressed cardboard and to bring inside the view after being handcuffed to the bars. On rare works, a motion is taken out, chained hand and foot, and the works themselves take place in another room with dimensions of 2.5 by 1.5 meters. The killer at this time is simultaneously watched by 6 guards, armed to the teeth, and several video cameras. As of today, Maudsley is ready to set a record for being in solitary confinement more than he has been alone with himself. Only Albert Woodfolks is the absolute world record holder with his 45 years. The maniac has few entertainments. He responds with his 2 nephews, reads books, and plays games on a PlayStation. The killer doesn't speak to the press, and all information about his life comes mainly from his nephew Robert. He lives in his own little world. He has TV, music, and his PlayStation. He says that in the real world there are some men about people that he would rather be alone. So says the man about his uncle, who, according to him, does not regret about anything, but just lives and tries to appreciate the little he has. Does the prisoner know that he became the prototype of the most famous maniac in cinema? Yes, Maudsley was informed that Harris used his story in his books, but anyway, he was completely indifferent to this and showed no interest in the novels and films. Thanks for watching. I recommend to watch other interesting and no less shocking stories. Subscribe to my channel and see you later.